Hi everybody, my name is George, and today we're going to be talking about the Fallout show. As the Fallout show has came out on Wednesday the 10th of April, and it has been a blast to watch one of the representations of one of my favorite game series of all time. Now, this channel isn't going to be usually talking about shows or being a game review channel, but due to the fact that this happens to be a show about a video game, I feel like I'm obligated to try and talk about it. Now, lucky enough for me, my two favorite game series of all time is Halo and Fallout, and to my surprise, both of those games have actually been able to get their somewhat close of a show or a movie, minus Forward Unto Dawn for Halo. Now, after the Halo show was just a complete letdown, it was kind of scary to see that Prime was trying to make a Fallout show, and I was a little worried about how they would represent the games incorrectly until I watched the first episode of the show. Now, to start things off, I want to say the Fallout show was amazing. Now, for a lot of fans, one of the most stressful things when it comes to people making a show about your game is to see how they represent it and to see if they mess with the plot points or the original story. And to my surprise, the show immediately made it so that they didn't mess with any plot points of the Fallout series. At the very beginning of the Fallout show, we see that the events of the show takes place 219 years after the bomb falls, which means that this show takes place in 2296, meaning that this is exactly 9 years after the events of the latest Fallout game, which is Fallout 4, which takes place in 2287. Now, one of the big reasons that the time that the show takes place matters is because right off the bat, when we started seeing the trailer of the Fallout show, a lot of fans started having a lot of weird speculations as to two big red flags that we saw in the trailer. One, we saw that the Brotherhood of Steel was in California, which is a big red flag due to the fact that during the events of the Fallout games, the Brotherhood of Steel got completely wiped out of the West Coast. Now, number two, the red flag is we started to see multiple Prydwins, which are those giant ships that they fly around. Now, the reason why we saw multiple and we got worried is because the first Prydwin was made in Fallout 4, and for what we knew, there was only one Prydwin. Now, I think that due to the fact that there is a 9-year gap, that makes a lot of importance, and that means a lot of things could change in the series. And if it wasn't for that year gap or that year time skip, then a lot of things wouldn't make sense for the show to really show off. But not only that, due to this game taking almost 10 years after Fallout 4 and about 15 years after New Vegas, this develops a lot of time in the story for things that happen. Especially one of the biggest things is the NCR. Now, the NCR were the biggest faction and owned most of the West Coast, but while it was explained in the events of Fallout New Vegas, we knew that due to the fact that the NCR got too big, that in the West Coast they were eventually going to run into a famine, which means that they wouldn't be there. Now, when I wrote the script for this, I wrote that when I was like episode 1 or 2, so I expected them to show a lot different of what happened in the show actually, but they still pretty much showed that the NCR were less prevalent in the West Coast. Now, with the way that the Fallout show is going in the development of its story, it's very fair to say that they did a good job at not just trying to recreate the events that we've already seen multiple times, but instead they're giving us new characters with a new story and a complete new timeline. And I want to also mention that one of the best things they're doing is they're taking a lot of the events of all the games that we played, and they're finally putting them together into just one big story, which I personally think is really cool to see. Now, I do want to say, right off the bat of the show, I was immediately captivated with the way they displayed the bombs falling. I think that was just such a good and dreadful way to show how scary that event would probably be. Now, but before I get into the show, I want to take a quick pit stop and I want to talk about the Great War. Because I think it's very important to talk about what actually happened with the Great War. And so if you already know what the Great War is or understand it, go ahead and skip to the timestamp on the screen. But if you're a little in the dark into why the world nuked itself, then go ahead and stick around. So, let's start off with what the Fallout universe actually is. What the events of Fallout that happens is Fallout is just a diversion of the path we took in normal history. In 1945, when we nuked the Japanese, we moved on and we just kept developing more and more nukes, but instead humanity and the Fallout universe took this divergence where after the nukes of Japan, we took nuclear power and we started putting it into the betterment of humanity. Rather, it was stuff like floating cars or giant vacuums or like even robot maids that could help you around the house. Due to this large production of more bigger and clunky objects due to nuclear power, it turned out that humanity got stuck in like a 1950s kind of retro style, even though they're in the year 2077, due to the fact that things like electronics and stuff got bigger instead of smaller. But of course, with humanity and the ever-increasing need for resources, we started to see that the countries would go eventually into a giant resource war. So at the time of this story, we had the big three superpowers, which is Russia, America, and China. Now, to understand the map of what the world looks like in this series, America owns pretty much most of the Americas, or if not allied with them. China owns the Pacific Islands, most of the mainland, including India and the East Coast and the Middle East, and then they also own a lot of Northern Asia as well. With both countries refusing to give up their title of a world superpower, this would eventually lead into the Great War, with starting out with China invading Alaska in order to seize the American oil wells there. This would cause the Alaskan War, or the Battle for Anchorage, which was one of the biggest battles in the series. This would start the Alaskan War front, and eventually this would cause millions upon millions of soldiers on both sides to lose their lives. Now, due to both of these countries going through so many losses without any sight of winning, it would be eventually that both sides would have to eventually adapt and create new technology in order to figure out who would eventually win. Both sides working against the clock to figure out who can make the first super weapon yet, eventually America won that race when they invented power armor. This polylaminate encased armor was just a giant armor that they put soldiers into, and they would drop them into Alaska and wipe out hordes of the Chinese soldiers. Eventually, this would push China out of Alaska, America would gain their land back. This would eventually end in the world seizing on October 23rd, 2077 with a great nuclear war. So, going back on track after our history lessons, let's start to talk about the show itself. So like I said, the show is amazing, but what makes it good? Well, to start off with, our main protagonist, Lucy, played by Ella Purnell, is honestly a perfect representation of what it would actually be like if a Vault Dweller saw the surface for the first time. In the games, we get a really good sense that the minute we leave the vault, our characters are usually just badass and crazy, but for Lucy, we see a more scared and naive approach to the Wasteland, which what makes up for her ignorance and lack of knowledge of the Wasteland, she is very good at adapting and changing her style. We even see this in episode 4 when Lucy leaves the supermarket, when she's seen completely adapt and ready for the Wasteland in her iconic armored vault suit, which is pretty cool to see. So with her constant okie dokies and her great ability to ignore many social cues, she makes a funny, kind, and badass protagonist, which bonus points actually to Ella Purnell, the actress for Lucy, where she's mentioned in interviews where before the role, she went back and played all the games to kind of understand how the Fallout series works. So, good job. Bonus points to you. First off, I want to focus on the fact that I really enjoy how they don't focus on the fact that it takes place in LA itself, due to the fact that it is all just a wasteland. And with that, I think they do a good job at keeping the Fallout show kind of similar to the feeling of the Fallout games, where no matter where you go, you feel like everything's foreign, as everything has been bombed to the point of unrecognizability. Even when we do see cities and towns, we do see a very rustic and distressed version of all these cities, and that's what brings me to Philly. Now, even though we don't get to see Philly for very long, I do think that Philly is a very good look at what a town or a city would actually look like in Fallout. Now, most settlements we are used to in the Fallout universe aren't actually outlawish as Philly gets, but it's also not fair to say that crime settlements don't exist in the Fallout universe. One thing I do want to point out is the fact that they put a plane on top of Philly, which is an awesome nod to the plane on top of Megaton in Fallout 3. Now, between Philly and Shady Sands, we don't really see many other settlements other than the supermarket, which usually means if you're about to go in one, then shit is about to go down. Now, I want to focus and talk about the story that the show itself tells us, because as it is a continuation of the Fallout story, I think it's also a very good one. Now, to understand things, we had to understand the different stories that are playing throughout the show. Starting off with Lucy and her quest to find her dad, she eventually in Philly runs into the ghoul, or as we know him as Cooper, who eventually explains to her that the guy, the scientist that she meets, is actually very important and worth a lot of caps. Here is also where Maximus's story aligns with the other two, as Maximus and Cooper start engaging each other and Lucy and the scientist run off. Later, the scientist reveals that he took cyanide, which then he forces Lucy to cut his head off. This turns the story into just a very long game of hot potato with the scientist's head, until episode 5, where things start to really hit the fan with the story. On episode 5, we start seeing flashes of Cooper's past, and we also start to see him and his wife's connection with Vault-Tec itself. Also, back at the vault in Vault 32 with Lucy's younger brother Norm, we also start to see him kind of understand the dark, twisted experiences of Vault 32. On the other side of the wasteland, Lucy and Maximus eventually make their way to Shady Sands, which this will become a very big plot point into the second half of the first season of the show. Now, without having to explain too much, Shady Sands is basically the capital of the NCR, which this was a very alarming for fans of Fallout to see, as Shady Sands is just bombed to hell. So what this might signify to us is that this is kind of like the downfall of the NCR, which is a big deal. So episodes 6 and 7 kind of stay at a halt for Lucy and Maximus' story, because this is where they eventually fall into the vault that was near Shady Sands. And the only thing we really revealed here is that Lucy found out that the vaults were actually experiments. Cooper's story while they were in the vault is where we really start to see things piece together, as we start to see Cooper's old past with Moldiver. We start to watch Cooper spying his wife, because at this point Moldiver told him that his wife was kind of shady. During his spying, we start to see the true colors of Vault-Tec, but not only this, we also get to see Lucy's dad and where he originally came from, Hank, as he was working for Vault-Tec at the time. It is also a big plot point that is revealed to us that Vault-Tec is actually the one that caused the war, so that they could profit off their vaults. Now, as a Fallout fan, this isn't actually a crazy plot point to us, because in the Fallout universe, we always thought that America and China nuked each other, but due to the events of Fallout 4, we start to slowly learn that it was actually Vault-Tec who shifted that nuking, if that makes sense. So for these next few episodes, Cooper as a ghoul in the story becomes kind of less apparent and important. While he's on his way of tracking the head, he makes a few pit stops. Though, one of these pit stops at the beginning of episode 7 is really important because we see 2 people in NCR Ranger armor. This is really important because this shows us that the NCR still actually has a good presence in the show, or we hope there is. And to what we find out during this pit stop is that those 2 Rangers are actually probably just a family of people with armor doing some lead farming. So around this time, Lucy and Maximus are eventually making their way to the observatory, where as they stop at a radio tower, Maximus gets picked up by the Brotherhood again, and Lucy starts making her way to the observatory, where, once she gets to the observatory, she for the first time sees a civilization that isn't riddled with crime, and is actually genuinely thriving. And here at the observatory is where the bombshells for the final episode really start to fall. Now, Maximus goes back to the Brotherhood, where we start to see that the Brotherhood actually took out Billy and probably killed all of its citizens. And here's where we see that the Brotherhood is going to start making a move on the observatory. And the observatory, as what we know, is the last remaining version of the NCR in the West Coast. They get on their helicopters, and with their Pridwin, they charge towards the observatory. While Lucy is at the observatory, she finally meets Moldiver. But not only that, but it is finally revealed that Lucy's dad is actually the one that bombed Shady Sands, and he also took Lucy's mother down with it, which we see Lucy's mother as a ghoul during this section. We also see that Hank was working with Vault-Tec and played a part into helping the vaults and also starting the bombing. Now, most importantly though, we actually finally see what Moldiver wanted the head for, and what we find is that that little chip in the scientist's head was cold fusion, and this was able to produce infinite energy, where Moldiver plugs it into her little computer thing, and she lights up the entire city ahead of the observatory. Taking a step back at the vaults, we start to see the events of Vault 33 citizens getting carried on into Vault 32. Around this time, Norm actually sneaks around and gets into the Overseer's terminal, and he gets access to Vault 31, which where we actually see the truth of Vault 31 is this little brain in a Roomba, which is Bud, and he basically put a bunch of people in cryo chambers so that they could cause a constant creation and death for humans and to create a constant management chain, where every time an Overseer is elected, it's always someone for Vault 31, including Norm and Lucy's dad, Hank. Okay, so now that the Brotherhood gets to the observatory, we see Hank get into a power armor suit and basically fly away. Cooper shows up out of nowhere after shitting on everyone there, and after the NCR and the Brotherhood fighting, it ends in a bloodbath with eventually the Brotherhood emerging victorious, and the city ahead of them remains lit up. Moldiver is dead, and Lucy and Cooper are on their way to hunt down her dad. Now for the final scene of the show, after Hank emerges from the rising sun, he eventually gets to the top of a hilltop where overlooking a vast wasteland, he sees a giant city in the background. Now, this giant city is New Vegas from, of course, the game Fallout New Vegas, and this is very important to see because this is definitely means this is where the second season is going to take place, most likely. Now, due to the fact that this is going to take place in New Vegas, we already know that the NCR is basically going to be very prevalent in New Vegas. But what really matters is why is Hank needing to go to New Vegas? Now, it is very hinted at in the show, but for Fallout fans, we all know kind of the big reason why he's going to New Vegas. Now, if you don't know anything about Fallout really, this might be a little hard to piece together, so this is where I'm going to want to now talk about the future of the Fallout show. So we know that Fallout Season 2 is going to most likely take place in Nevada, New Vegas, but what we don't actually know is why Hank is going to New Vegas. And I think it is most likely that Hank is heading here to go see the head of Robco, Mr. House, also this guy with the sexy mustache in the meetings. Now, Mr. House is important because not only does he own New Vegas, but this also heavily implies that Mr. House won the Battle of New Vegas, meaning that the Mr. House ending to Fallout New Vegas is the canon ending. Now, Fallout New Vegas had 4 endings. This was rather the Yes Man ending, where you, the main character, basically wins the wasteland. You have the Mr. House ending, which Mr. House can rather choose if he wants Caesar's Legion to win, but he will most likely want you to have NCR controlling. Or you could side with the Caesar's Legion, which is basically another faction I'll explain in a second, or you could side with just the NCR, which usually they'll ask you to kill Mr. House. But out of these 4 endings, if Hank is going to New Vegas, that must mean that Mr. House won the Vegas conflict, meaning he also used NCR. So what this means is that the NCR will be in Vegas, but Mr. House will most likely be in control of Vegas itself. Quickly, I'd like to explain why Fallout New Vegas is important. Fallout New Vegas is what we know as the furthest continuation of the story of what's happening in the Fallout universe in the West Coast. From what we're seeing, especially with the show, we know that Mr. House won, and the NCR also won the Great Battle. Now, if you're wondering what this battle is, this is the Battle of Hoover Dam. Hoover Dam is basically the bridge that connects the Nevada part of Vegas away from the more eastern Colorado side. And one of the biggest factions that cause a problem in the New Vegas storyline is Caesar's Legion. Caesar's Legion is a military that started out in Colorado, and they basically took the football pads from a football stadium, made their armor out of it, and since Caesar as a kid, he was a part of the Followers of Apocalypse, he read a lot about the Roman Empire and all that, so when he made Caesar's Legion, he basically made them look like they're from the Roman Empire and had a lot of their training and learning from the Roman Empire. So, Caesar's Legion from Colorado proceeds to push west and wipe out 76 different tribes, turning them all into Caesar's Legion. Then the Legion gets over to Vegas, where on one end of the Colorado River, they are holding their force down, ready to push on the Hoover Dam, and on the NCR side, they're trying to hold Vegas with its power and its glory and keep it away from the Legion. This is where it gets a little complicated on where the story of Fallout Season 2 can go and how they will decide the fate of New Vegas. What we know is that Lucy, Hank, and Cooper are going to be going to New Vegas. we know that the only reason for Hank to go to New Vegas is most likely miss her house, and if there's something different, then I am very excited to see what they tweak. Now, we also know that the Brotherhood of Steel, and especially Maximus, one way or another, are going to come towards Vegas. So from what I can assume, there's 4 ways this can end. The 4 main characters end up going to New Vegas, and they're surrounded.
So if you're seeing this, the camera quality is probably going to change. That's because my camera kept fucking dying, so I basically swapped. I'm using my phone camera now, so hopefully it looks good. Hopefully it also doesn't stop recording, or I might lose my mind. Anyways, continuing on. So as I was saying, with the 4 different possibilities that I think Fallout Season 2 can take, I think 1, the Brotherhood of Steel are going to push into New Vegas, and that's going to cause a conflict between the NCR and the Brotherhood of Steel once again. I think option 2 is that our 4 main characters just kind of go into Vegas on a side quest and the world just kind of builds around them, which is its own thing. I think number 3, there is some type of outer conflict, but I think the main characters are going to run into something that is bigger than them, and they might get stuck in that conflict, which is kind of just how all the Fallout games are told. And I think there's option 4, and this is my favorite option, and I hope they come at some part in the game. I think that Caesar's Legion, or Caesar's Legion, will probably try to push for maybe a 3rd Battle of Hoover Dam, or maybe push into New Vegas. Now this is important because maybe there's a good chance that if the Brotherhood, NCR, and Legion are all here, there's a chance we might actually see the Brotherhood fighting the Legion, but who's to say? Now, talking about this is all really important because this might be that New Vegas might be the biggest power point of just the entire Fallout series in general. This is because this might be one of the biggest power struggle we've ever seen for Control. And this is because New Vegas, not only does it have Hoover Dam, but it also has Helios 1, which is a side quest you go on in the game where basically you direct power to whoever side you're working with wants you to direct power to. If you're with the NCR, they're going to want you to direct it to the Strip, with the Strip at New Vegas, and they're going to want you to direct it to their headquarters, which is Cairn. Not only with the Legion, Brotherhood of Steel, and Nevada, and NCR coming here, there might be something crazy that we're about to see that we're just not ready for. So I'm very excited and interested. Now, another faction I want to mention really quickly, because they barely mentioned it in the show, but it's the Enclave, and I want to see, will the Enclave maybe step foot into Nevada? Now we know that the Enclave probably had presence in Nevada before, and we know that we've seen the Enclave in Fallout 4 with their suits, and we've seen the Enclave in Fallout New Vegas where you can find out one unit where you have to get them all back together again. But we haven't really, after their downfall with the explosion of Raven Rock in Fallout 3, we haven't seen the Enclave in a really, really long time. So I think it'd be interesting if we got like a little sneak peek in the Enclave, or maybe since we haven't seen the Enclave for so long, maybe like Season 3, or at like the end of Season 2, the Enclave comes out of nowhere and they're like, yo, we're back, we're gonna fuck some shit up, get ready to deal with us again. 3 times, baby, 3rd time's a charm. Now, also going back to Caesar's Legion, something I want to mention before going is during the events of Fallout New Vegas, Caesar actually has a brain tumor, so it's assumed that if you're not siding with the Legion, he probably dies. And Legate Lanius is also probably dead due to the fact that we know that Mr. Halston, the NCR won, so Legate Lanius is probably gone, and Caesar's dead. So without any real leadership in the west part of the Legion, who's to say the Legion might even be coming back? But it is fair to say that during Fallout New Vegas, a lot of people will mention that even if you killed Caesar, someone else will step into power. So maybe we will see that someone else, if the events that I'm thinking of go the way they do. So, with all this being said, this was a very fun video to make, and this was a very fun show to watch. So hopefully, if you enjoyed this, please leave a comment, like, and subscribe, and maybe talk about the show, or talk about something you might think for the next season, or tell me how you enjoyed the show. Also, if you haven't seen the show yet, go ahead and watch it. I think even for a show that's a video game, as a show itself, it's so good. Like, it doesn't need to be backed by Fallout. If they just made it and made it out there, it would be so good, in my opinion. But anyways, That's all for today. You guys have a good one, and bye-bye.
I'll try hard, ignoring those lips I adore. But how long can anyone try?